Others who've joined us today. I'm glad to introduce Professor Henry Giroux, our esteemed speaker today. Professor Giroux is the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in Public Interest and the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. An internationally renowned writer and a cultural critic, Professor Giroux has authored over 65 books, written several scholarly articles, and been a regular contributor to print, television, and varied media outlets. He co-edited a series on education.
Derides any notion of critical education. That is, an education that equips individuals to think critically, take risk, think against the grain, engage in thoughtful dialogue, appropriate the lessons of history, and learn, more importantly, how to hold power accountable. At the same time, the claims of neoliberal capitalism have been undermined as a result of the economic failures and medical horrors let loose by the pandemic, not to mention the financial crisis, of course, of 2009. It's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for taking seriously critical pedagogy and its ongoing attempts to make education central to politics. At stake here is the notion that education is a social concept. Enable people only to be critical thinkers, but also engaged individuals and social agents. This is a pedagogy that calls us beyond ourselves and engages the ethical imperative to care for others, dismantle structures of domination and to become subjects rather than the objects of history, politics, and power. If we're going to develop a politics, it seems to me that it's crucial for educators and others to remember that critical pedagogy's emphasis on education as a project of social and collective empowerment is based not only on the search for truth, but also the practice of freedom. This is a political project in which civic literacy is infused with the language of critique and possibility, while simultaneously addressing the notion that there is no democracy without knowledgeable and civically literate citizens. Such a language is necessary to enable the conditions to forge a collective international resistance among educators, youth, artists, and other cultural workers, at the very least, in defense of what we might call public goods. Such a movement is important to resist and overcome the tyrannical fascist nightmares that have descended upon the United States, Brazil, India, and a number of other countries, plagued by the rise of right-wing populism and a politics of exclusion and disposability. In an age of social isolation, information overflow, a culture of immediacy, consumer glut, and a spectacularized violence, it is all the more important to take seriously the notion that democracy cannot exist once again or be defended without a civically literate, informed, and critically engaged public. Education, in both its symbolic and institutional forms, has a central role to play in fighting the resurgence of anti-democratic cultures. Mythize that education as a form of cultural work extends far beyond the classroom and its pedagogical influence, though this is often imperceptible. And this is necessary, it seems to me, to challenge and to resist the rise of fascist pedagogical formations and their rehabilitation of fascist principles and ideas. I mean, some of you may know that in the United States, for right now, we have, for instance, a right-wing Republican Party that is doing everything it can to ban the very notion of critique, the very notion of a history that it finds uncomfortable, and a very notion of pedagogy that in some way allows students to be critical, to be informed, to engage in dialogue, and to engage in a culture of questioning rather than a politics of conformity and repression. This is nothing that I haven't seen anything like this in 40 years. Very dangerous, and it increasingly becomes a model, to say the very least, for other countries. The pedagogical lesson here is that fascism begins with hateful words, the demonization of others considered disposable, and moves on to attack, it seems to me, it moves on to attack critical ideas, the burning of books, the disappearance of intellectuals, and the horrors of detention jails and camps. As a form of critical cultural politics, critical pedagogy provides the promise of a protected space within which to think against the grain of received opinion, a space to question and challenge, to imagine the world from different standpoints and perspectives, to reflect upon ourselves in relation to others, and in doing so, to understand what it means to assume a sense of political and social responsibility. This is particularly important when living in a neoliberal society that, as I said earlier, removes activity from social course, particularly economic activity. So what you have here is what I have called recently a politics of ethicide. That is, a politics that eschews all sense of social responsibility, all sense of social cost, and in doing so, undermines, degrades, and dismantles the very notion of the common good and the institutions that support it. Cultural politics since the 1980s has turned toxic as ruling elites increasingly gain control of commanding cultural apparatuses, turning them into pedagogical disimagination machines that serve the forces of ethical tranquilization by producing and legitimating endless degrading and humiliating images of the poor, immigrants, Muslims, and others considered excess, dismissed as wasted lives, doomed to what we might call terminal exclusion. In the new landscapes of wealth, fraud, social atomization, a savage and fanatical capitalism promises a winner-take-all ethos, normalizes massive inequalities in wealth and power, and aggressively undermines the welfare state while pushing millions into hardship and misery. The geographies of moral and political decadence have become the organizing standard of the dream worlds of consumption, privatization, surveillance, and deregulation. Within this increasingly precarious landscape, public spheres are replaced by zones of social abandonment and thrive on the energies of the walking dead, who it seems to me are the embodiment of a culture of manufactured ignorance, cruelty, and misery. Education within the last 3 decades has diminished rapidly in its capacities to educate young people and others to be reflective, critical, and socially engaged agents. Under neoliberal regimes, the utopian possibilities formerly associated with public and higher education as a public good capable of promoting social equality and supporting democracy have become too dangerous for the apostles of authoritarianism. Increasingly, public schools are subject to the toxic forces of privatization and mindless standardized curricula, while teachers are de-skilled and subject to intolerable labor conditions. Higher education now mimics a business culture run by a managerial army of bureaucrats, enamored of market values, who resemble the high priest of a deadening instrumental rationality. In the US, right-wing Republicans are whitewashing history, banning books, and attacking progressive teachers. For instance, in the age of pandemic pedagogy, pedagogy is also being reduced to a crude instrumental rationality focused on training exercises to familiarize teachers and students with Zoom, Teams, and other methods of online teaching. It's not that something is wrong with these things, it's just that they elevate the logic of instrumental rationality to a model that overtakes all other aspects, emancipatory and empowering aspects of education. The commanding visions of democracy no longer, it seems they are in exile at all levels of education. And the question of what education can do for democracy and what its relationship is begins to disappear. Critical thought and the imaginings of a better world present a direct threat to authoritarians who believe that the future must always replicate the present in an endless circle in which capital and the identities that it legitimates merge with each other into what might be called a dead zone of the imagination and pedagogies of repression. Pedagogy has become, in multiple sites, instrumental, privatized, and anti-intellectual, a politics of repression and conformity. Pedagogy, it seems to me, as a result, it seems to me, the distinction between education and training has collapsed. And the most valued educational experiences are geared to job preparation. Young people are now told to invest in their careers, pack their resumes, and achieve success at any cost. It is precisely this replacement of educated hope with an aggressive dystopian neoliberal project and cultural politics that now characterizes the current assault on public and higher education, I would argue, in various parts of the globe. Under neoliberalism, the mantra of privatization, deregulation, and the destruction of the public good is matched by the nativist language of borders, walls, and camps. We not only create gated schools, we now create gated intellectuals. It is crucial for educators to remember that language is not simply an instrument of fear, violence, and intimidation. It's also a vehicle for critique, civic courage, resistance, and engaged and informed agency. We live at a time when the language of democracy has been pillaged, stripped of its promises and hopes. For instance, in the age of alleged fake news and post-truth, The degradation of language reinforces Umberto Eco's remark that education as an organizing feature of fascism, quote, undermines civic literacy and produces an impoverished vocabulary and elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments of complex and critical reasoning. If right-wing populism and authoritarianism is to be defeated, there's a need to make education an organizing principle of politics, and in part, this can be done with a language that exposes and unravels falsehoods, systems of oppression, and corrupt relations of power, while making clear that an alternative future is possible. Hannah Arendt was right in arguing that language is crucial in highlighting the often hidden, crystallized elements that make fascism likely. Language is a powerful tool in which the search for truth and the condemnation of falsehoods and injustices take place. Moreover, it is through language that the history of fascism can be remembered, and the lessons of the conditions that created the plague of genocide can provide the recognition that fascism does not reside solely in the past, and that its traces are always dormant, even in the strongest democracies. This is one more reason for educators to make the political more pedagogical and the pedagogical more political. The latter is crucial in order to recognize, as my former colleague Paulo Freire reminded us, that pedagogy is always a struggle over agency, identities, desires, and values, while also acknowledging that it has a crucial role to play in addressing important social issues and defending higher education, all forms of education, as democratic public spheres. Making the political pedagogical, in this instance, suggests producing modes of knowledge and social practices that not only affirm oppositional cultural work and pedagogical practices, but also offer opportunities to mobilize instances of collective outrage coupled with direct mass action against a ruthless gangster neoliberal capitalism and an emerging fascist politics. Such mobilization must oppose the glaring inequities and the growing cynical belief that democracy and capitalism are synonymous. At the very least, critical pedagogy proposes that education is a form of political intervention in the world that is capable of creating the possibilities for individual and social transformation. Ignorance now rules America, Brazil, India, and other right-wing countries caught in a tsunami of lies and death-dealing propaganda. This is not the simple, if somewhat innocent ignorance that comes to mind from an absence of knowledge, but a malicious ignorance forged in the arrogance of refusing to think hard about an issue, to engage language in the pursuit of justice. The novelist James Baldwin was certainly right in issuing the stern warning in his book, No Name in the Street, that, quote, ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. Thinking is now viewed as cultures of critical thought appear only at the margins of the culture. Under former President Trump, ignorance became an organizing principle of American society. The social media and corporate controlled cultural apparatuses not only normalize ignorance, they also position themselves as the enemy of critical thinking, dissent, engaged intellectuals, and emancipatory forms of education. Ignorance is not innocent, especially when it labels thinking dangerous while exhibiting a disdain for the truth, scientific evidence, and rational judgments. However, there's more at stake here than the production of a toxic form of illiteracy celebrated as common sense, the normalization of fake news, and the shrinking of political horizons. There is also the closing of the horizons of the political and the pedagogical, coupled with explicit expressions of cruelty and a widely sanctioned ruthlessness. Under such circumstances, there is a full-scale attack on thoughtful reasoning, empathy, collective resistance, and the compassionate imagination. In some ways, the dictatorship of ignorance resembles what the writer John Berger calls, and what I have called, ethicide, and which is an erasure of the connections with the past, the dead, the land, the place, the soil, possibly too the erasure even of certain emotions, whether pity, compassion, consoling, mourning, or hoping, unquote. Words such as love, trust, freedom, responsibility, and choice have been deformed by a market logic that narrows their meaning to either a commodity or reductive notion of self-interest. Freedom, as we saw in the Trucker Freedom Convoy in Canada and the one that's now emerging in the United States, now means removing oneself from any sense of social responsibility so one can retreat into the privatized orbits of self-interest and self-indulgence, and so it goes. The new form of illiteracy does not simply constitute an absence of learning, ideas, or knowledge, nor can it be solely attributed to what has been called the smartphone society. On the contrary, it's a willful practice whose purpose is to actively depoliticize people and make them complicit with the forces that impose misery and suffering upon their lives. Given the current crisis of politics, agency, history, and memory, educators need a new political and pedagogical language for addressing the changing context and issues facing a world in which capital draws upon an unprecedented convergence of resources, financial, cultural, political, economic, scientific, military, and technological, to exercise powerful and diverse forms of control. If educators and others are to counter global capitalism's increased ability to separate the traditional spheres of politics from the now national reach of power, it's crucial to develop educational approaches that reject a collapse of the distinction between market liberties and civil liberties, a market economy and a market society. Resistance does not begin with reforming capitalism, but abolishing it. In this instance, critical pedagogy becomes a moral and political practice in the fight to revive civic literacy, civic culture, and the notion of a shared and engaged citizenship. Politics loses its emancipatory possibilities if it cannot understand or provide the educational conditions for enabling students and others to think against the grain, where students can realize themselves as informed, critical, and engaged citizens willing to fight when necessary for democratic social change. There is no radical politics without a pedagogy capable of awakening consciousness, challenging common sense, and creating modes of analysis in which people discover a moment of recognition that enables them to rethink the conditions that change their lives. As a rule, educators should do more than create the conditions for critical thinking and nourishing a sense of hope in their students. They also need to responsibly assume the role of public intellectuals and border crossers within broader social contexts, and be willing to share their ideas with other educators and the wider public by making use of new media technologies. They need to communicate to a variety of public audiences, which suggests using opportunities for writing, public talks, and media interviews offered by radio, internet, alternative magazines, and teaching young people and adults in alternative schools, to name only a few of the options that might exist. Capitalizing on their role as citizen educators, faculty can speak to a more general audiences in a language that is clear, accessible, and rigorous. The notion that there is a distinction or a sharp contrast between rigorous theoretical formulations and accessibility strikes me as nonsense. More importantly, as teachers organize to assert both the importance of their role as citizen educators and public educators, and that of education in a democracy, they can forge new alliances and connections to develop social movements that include and expand working both within and beyond unions. In the current moment, it's all the more crucial to embrace critical pedagogy as a political and moral practice that cannot be removed from issues of power, assigned meanings, and definitions of the future. Education operates as a crucial site of power in the modern world. And if teachers are truly concerned about safeguarding education, they will have to take seriously how pedagogy functions on local and global levels. Critical pedagogy has an important role to play in both understanding and challenging how power, knowledge, and values are deployed, affirmed, and resisted within and outside not only the classroom, but traditional discourses and public and cultural spheres. In the local context, critical pedagogy becomes an important critical and theoretical tool for understanding the institutional conditions that place constraints on the production of knowledge, learning, academic labor, social relations, and democracy itself. It should also provide discourses for engaging and challenging the construction of social hierarchies, identities, and ideologies as they traverse across national boundaries and borders. In addition, pedagogy as a form of production and critique offers a discourse of possibility, a way of providing students with the opportunity to link understanding to commitment and social transformation to seeking the greatest possible justice. In short, it also works hard to attempt to produce a sense of the future that does not simply mimic the present. This suggests that one of the most serious challenges facing teachers, artists, journalists, writers, and other cultural workers is the task of developing a language and a discourse and pedagogical practices that connect a critical reading of both the word and the world in ways that enhance the creative capacities of young people and provide the conditions for them to become critically engaged agents. In taking up this project, educators and others should attempt to create the conditions that give students the opportunity to acquire the knowledge, the values, and the civic courage that enables them to struggle in order to make desolation and cynicism unconvincing and hope practical. Hope in this instance is educational, removed from the fantasy of an idealism that is unaware of the constraints facing the struggle for a substantive democratic society. Educated hope is not a call to overlook the difficult conditions that shape both schools and the larger social order, nor is it a blueprint removed from specific contexts and struggles. On the contrary, it is the precondition for imagining a future that does not replicate the nightmares of the present, for not making the present the future. Educated hope should be a form of active social hope that dignifies the labor of teachers, offers up critical knowledge linked to democratic social change, affirms shared responsibilities, and encourages teachers and students to recognize ambivalence and uncertainty as fundamental dimensions of learning. Such hope offers the possibility of thinking beyond the given. Hope is the affective and intellectual precondition for individual and social struggle. Hope, not despair, is the precondition that encourages critique on the part of intellectuals in and outside of the academy who use the resources of theory to address pressing social problems. Building a better future than the one we now expect to unfold will require nothing less than confronting the flow of everyday experience and the weight of social suffering with the force of individual and collective resistance and the unending project of democratic social transformation. This merging of politics and pedagogy is rooted in the dream of a collective consciousness and imagination, fueled by the struggle for new forms of agency and community that affirm the value of the social economic equality, the social contract, and democratic values and social relations. The current fight against a burgeoning fascism across the globe is not only a struggle over economic structures, or the commanding heights of corporate and financial power, or religious orthodoxy. It's a struggle over identities, visions, ideas, consciousness, and the power to shift the culture itself. It is, as Hannah Arendt points out, a struggle against the widespread fear of judging. Without the ability to judge, it becomes impossible to recover words that have meaning, imagine a future that does not mimic the dark times in which we live, and create a language that changes how we think about ourselves and our relationship to others. Any struggle for a radical democratic socialist order will not take place without an education that offers constructive resolutions and solutions for struggling for and creating a post-capitalist society. In the end, there is no democracy without informed citizens and no justice without a language critical of injustice. Democracy begins to fail and political life becomes impoverished in the absence of these vital public spheres, such as public and higher education, in which civic values, public scholarship, seriously, that thrives on connecting pedagogy to the practice of freedom. learning to ethics, and agency to the imperatives of social responsibility and the public good. The fact remains that without hope, there is no agency, and without collective agency, it's not enough to connect education with the defense of reason, informed judgment, and critical consciousness. It must also be aligned with power and the potential of collective resistance. We live in dangerous times. Consequently, there's an urgent need for more individuals, institutions, and social movements to come together in the belief that the current regimes of tyranny can be resisted, that alternative futures are possible, and that acting on those beliefs through collective resistance will make radical change happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Giroux, for an enriching lecture. Your vision of critical pedagogy speaks to us as it advocates the need to make pedagogy central to politics itself and to help create the conditions necessary for the formation of a culture that provides the foundation of a meaningful and substantive democracy. Your talk has provided us with an opportunity to situate the current socio-political changes within a larger framework, to see that these times of uncertainty can be a time for possibility, a possibility of educated hope, to imagine a future very different from the present. You have highlighted that there is hope in collective resistance, a hope that education can subvert the relations of power, that new pedagogical language could be tool for social change, that educators are cultural producers and not merely cultural critics. I am sure your words have inspired all of us to create spaces to engage with possibilities of struggle, of resistance, and envisioning alternatives. Thank you once again. Uh, Professor Giroux, with your permission, may we take the questions now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I think Mansi has raised her hand and she wants to ask for a while. Mansi, would you like to unmute and ask?
That was by mistake, sorry. Dr. Latika hand is up.
Thank you, Professor Giroux. It was a wonderful and a very energy-filling talk. I want to ask you that the distinction between the left and the right as it exists in the Western societies is not really the same in India. Because you know that there is a anti-colonial wave of thought here that also looks like the right here. So people who indulge in critical pedagogy or engage in critical pedagogy, they basically have to fight the two rights. One is the right wing, the conservative forces, and the second is the progressive looking but very traditional, right, that is still fighting what got introduced here by the British. So would you like to say something about that combination?
Professor Giroux, you have to unmute yourself. I think.
Yeah, I am. Thank you. I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll try to answer it the best way I can. I think that if the question is how is the complexity of what is happening in India different from the complexity of what's happening sometimes in the West, particularly between the right and the left. I think that where the right will use an anti-colonial discourse with the logic of disposability as one of its aims, that is certainly a distinction that does not characterize the left. That is taking up questions of decolonization, particularly in the United States. I also think that what we have on the right, operating under the guise of an anti-colonizing logic is the creation of a kind of mythic history that basically serves to enforce a kind of ultranationalism that I think many people on the left in the United States who would address that context would not agree with under any circumstances. There is also, it seems to me, the notion that the anti-colonialist in India would not find themselves on the side of a feminist pedagogy because of the way in which it masculinizes the public sphere and the cultural realm in a way that the left would. So I think these are really quite distinct moments. I mean, I'm thinking about Trump, for instance, who was on the right, but would claimed he was against globalization, and certainly would not address in any fundamental way. I mean, this is another distinction. Would not address in any fundamental way the question of colonization and how it works, given his own addiction to a kind of racial cleansing and a racial purity. And I think this is the key for me. The key for me is that fascist moment when racial purity enters into the alleged discourse of freedom and emancipation. That's a very distinctive moment because it expands the logic of disposability in an allegedly progressive and critical discourse, which invalidates it in the end. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Yes, thanks.
There is another question by Alan Bosco. The question is, there has been a creation of apolitical teacher and student. What arguments would you give to deconstruct this apolitical construct?
I think it's basically nothing more than a cover for the most oppressive forms of pedagogy, because it seems to suggest that power has nothing to do with education. And it also seems to suggest that education is by itself, default, a kind of neutral enterprise. Or the relationship between the state and education. But I want to make a distinction that I think is probably more relevant here, and that is there's a difference between what I call political education and politicizing education. Political education means that education is never removed from power. We choose books, we choose knowledge, we organize students in particular ways, we talk about history in particular ways, we in some ways present a discourse that implies something about the future. And education is always a struggle over agency. It's always a struggle over narratives about ourselves and how we identify ourselves. So it seems to me it's always political, and we need to educate students about the political nature of education because basically it bears down on them and shapes their lives. And not to do that is to basically put them in a position where they don't realize they're being immersed in a whole series of ideological networks and narratives that basically they don't have the right as well as the competencies to engage. Now, education is politicizing when in fact we recognize politics is there, but we impose on students a propagandistic, one-dimensional line about education that offers no possibilities for extending their capacities to be critically engaged citizens. So it seems to me that we have to make a defense for education is political, and we have to make a defense for education against being politicizing. And I might add that politicizing education often takes place in the name of a discourse that is makes the claim to be neutral. So it literally politicizes by hiding its own politics.
I think Mansoor wants to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you, Professor, for a very thoughtful lecture. Sir, I believe we are living in a time where, as a teacher in higher education, we have a very limited mandate as far as the politics and the other things in the society is concerned, because since the education has been taken over, especially higher education has been taken over by the bureaucratization. So in what ways, how can a teacher negotiate in these difficult times, going beyond classroom? We have very limited as far as stakes teachers are not involved other than going to the classes. So could you please help us understand how a teacher in higher education will negotiate these difficult times and to build hope in the students? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a terrific question. I think there are a couple of issues, and not to suggest I have, all the answers for this, but I think first of all, I think teachers have to work collectively and not simply individually in attempting to create some kind of space where they have more control over their classrooms and the educational experience and the labor conditions under which they operate. This is a collective struggle. It can only take place if teachers come together, form unions, form organizations that can bring power to bear collectively on the state and on the individual institutions per se. Secondly, I think that academics have a real responsibility here to be able to both convince the public that education is so central to a democracy that you cannot leave it in the hands of corporate-minded bureaucrats, that this bureaucracy is not about education, it's about training. And it basically does not create the conditions for students in some fundamental way to be able to take control of their lives and to be able to shape the future. That is absolutely antithetical to that. And that education is crucial, critical education, democratic education is crucial for everyone, not just the children who are going to the university. It's how might you say it? It's an absolute essential element of the social contract and the social good. It's a social good. Thirdly, I think faculty have to join with movements outside of education. These movements have to come together, make education central to democracy itself, and learn how to fight both at the local and the national and levels in order to rethink the very meaning and vision of education. We're not just talking about horrible labor conditions for teachers, whether it's low pay, loss of autonomy. We're talking about a view of education that's been colonized, that's been taken over by finance capitalism, religious fundamentalists, in ways to align education not with democracy, but with authoritarianism, whether it's corporate, whether it's capitalist, or whether it's religious. And I think that we need to make this message very clear, form the alliances that basically can address this, and stop believing that individually, that we alone need tactics or skills by which to address this problem. That's a death-dealing tactic, because under neoliberal capitalism, what they want all of us to believe is that these problems are individual problems, and the only solution is one that we can address on the part of our own resources, individual resources, and possibilities.
Thank you.
I think Aruna wants to ask a question. Aruna? Okay, I think I can. Can we find any? Okay, are you speaking, Aruna? Okay, so I would take another question. Can we find any connection in the critical pedagogy of Paulo Freire and Gijubhai? This is by Siraj Ansari.
Sorry, what I understood the between the critical pedagogy of Paulo Freire and whom?
And Gijubhai Badeka, the educationist after whom we have named this lecture.
No, I'm sorry. I don't know enough about that person to make a commentary.
Any other questions?
Can I ask?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Sir, thanks for the wonderful lecture and the insights and the things that you have shared is very relevant. And this morning it was very disturbing for me when I started following the Ukraine and the Russian war. So one thing was very quite striking in me, that today we are still fighting, right? Though we are educated, we have parameters to measure what is a literacy in the countries that we are living. Still, a question is unanswerable. Are we really like having our industries to produce more ammunitions? Are we literating people, or the masses, to become again slave of some other culture? What is the real idea that we are all have to get educated? What do we see? Like, I feel very painful often sometime. What is the purpose of me living and getting higher education, or knowing more things? As I go deep down, I get to know more things, but I tend to lose myself. So I stop there, and I request you to respond.
I think that the issue is not about whether we should get education, for instance, to get credentials or to simply get degrees. I think that education is a form of power. I think it contributes to our understanding the world in a way that gives us more resources, more insights, and more ways to basically mediate the complex relationships in which we find ourselves, whether they be economic, political, or otherwise. I mean, I think that the last thing that we want to do is to operate off the assumption that education is a burden. I mean, that's exactly what fascists want us to do. They want us to believe that ignorance is comfortable, comforting, and that we don't need to know anything, or we don't need to know more, or we don't need to understand a world that's changing in a way that demands more understanding or more knowledge. So I think as frustrating as it is sometimes, to try to educate ourselves or learn from others, I think this is an imperative, and this falls on the side of a form of self and social responsibility that we can't run away from. I think that it's very easy to say that educating ourselves is worthless or a burden. And I think in doing so, we commit an act of self-sabotage. I think we begin to cripple our own sense of agency. I think we limit it. And by doing that, we tend to become either cynical or complicitous with forces that will argue that they can think for us, that we don't have to think. I mean, I think that one of the things that I never forgot with respect to former President Trump, the reigning white supremacist in the United States, is that he said he loved the uneducated. And I think the essence of his comment was clear. I'll think for you. And that this is what cults do. The leaders of cults say, I'll do all the thinking. You don't have to do anything. Just follow me. So I think we have to be careful, because I think that not only does that suggest a form of anti-intellectualism that's dangerous, it actually creates a form of mass ignorance that leads to very dire and often dreadful consequences.
Another question wherein Ramamurthy Sharma seeks an answer to in what way role of teacher collective should be changed to form larger alliances in the society?
Would you repeat that?
In what way role of teacher collective should be changed to form larger alliances within a society?
Well, I think that teachers need to form two things. They need to form national organizations based on a vision of higher education as a democratic public sphere and absolutely essential to democracy. And I think they need to cross borders and form alliances internationally with other progressive educators who are working in different contexts, but at the same time facing what I would call a larger question, and that is how to fight the globalization of capitalism and the emerging fascism that we see all around us. And secondly, how in fact to develop a range of pedagogical practices and policies and movements that give us more power to be able to change both the direction of education and the societies that we live in. This is both a national problem and an international problem. I mean, I think that one of the things that we should recognize with respect to talking about democracy, the relationship between democracy and education, is that power is global today and politics is local. And the people who have power, who are global, they don't care about national politics. They really don't care about that at all. Money floats. You don't like what workers are being paid? We'll go to China. They drain national states of their resources. And this is not a call for an ultranationalism. It's a call for an internationalism in which capitalism and the corporate elite and authoritarians don't have the massive economic and financial power that they have to be able to shape global interests in ways that create massive degrees of inequality, absolutely undermine democratic forms of education, and view dissent as something toxic and poisonous that has to be eliminated.
Thank you for that response. Charu Gupta has asked, as in India, we have been inching toward a genocide, while at the same time there has been no outrage from the majority. And one usually comes across a deafening silence, even by so-called progressives, on the issues related to persecutions of religious minorities. So how can then now a collective resistance possibly be built up? What forms of resistance could possibly be offered through educational spaces to counter this state-sponsored majoritarianism?
I think that I think we have to make clear what the stakes are here in these kinds of struggles. When you have states that basically operate off a logic of racial cleansing and religious persecution and engages in a politics of disposability, I think the first thing we have to do is learn from the past as to what this suggests. And I guess what it suggests is an image that we don't want to replicate. And we've seen it in Nazi Germany. We saw it in Argentina, in Chile under the dictatorships. We saw it under Pinochet. And we see it now in a number of other countries, in Hungary, in Turkey, increasingly with the Republican Party in the United States. So I think the first thing to recognize is that we're not just talking about discrimination, and we're not just talking about cultural cleansing. We're talking about a fascist politics that threatens both India and the globe. And it seems to me it's crucial that people in some fundamental way learn from this and begin to organize politically in the name of what I would call a socialist democracy, for which there is no room for connecting policies to racial cleansing and religious discrimination and religious forms of religious genocide, nor is there any room for institutions that support this, so that we're engaged in a massive political struggle here, of which education is central. And at the same time, we're engaged in a struggle to revive what I would call an historical consciousness in form of moral witnessing that is capable of inspiring and energizing people to think in through a language that they probably have not taken seriously until they've been confronted with this massive image of potential genocide.
Thank you. I believe Shirley wanted to ask a question. Shirley?
Thanks, Professor Gijubhai. My question is about what happened. Would this lead to a sort of deeper a strengthening of the neoliberal forces? There will be greater resistance.
I'm sorry.
Shirley, could you repeat your question, please?
Yeah, I said, Professor Gijubhai, we've been having, the war has sort of started today in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, which is NATO and Russia. I'm just wondering if this is sort of a beginning of deepening of neoliberal forces, strengthening the neoliberal forces, the military industrial complexes, are they going to get strengthened with this? Or are we going to see, because people are going to face immense difficulty across the globe, I think, will there be greater resistance? What kind of a tunnel are we in?
That's a terrific question. Thank you so much. We're not just dealing with the authoritarianism of Putin. We're dealing with an authoritarian, militarized industrial complex that basically benefits from war. The United States is the largest arms producer in the world. NATO has bases all over the world. This is not to suggest in any way that Putin's authoritarianism and aggression is justified. But what it does suggest is that on an international level, we've got to understand how the complexities of militarism and authoritarianism literally feed each other, even when they're at war with each other. So yes, I think that one of the greatest challenges we face throughout the globe, and we've seen in instances of its effects today and yesterday, is that there was a massive attempt on the part of both liberal governments and authoritarian governments. In some ways, one is very overt about militarism and the way, the role it plays in its social order, whether it's from suppressing dissent or killing journalists, where the other hides behind the language of democracy and imposing through its military industrial surveillance security complexes conditions that make the world fraught with the kind of danger in which war will be erupting across the globe, and hopefully not the potential to both destroy the planet, nuclear war, and the demise of democracy. These are interrelated, and we need a complex understanding of how they work. I have, by the way, I have maybe one more question I can take before I have an appointment at 10:15. So
yeah, Anthony had raised his hand. Anthony? Anthony and Lokesh Rao had raised their hands. Could one of you ask the question, please?
I already asked. Maybe Riddhi also had raised her hand.
Okay, one of
Thank
you please ask. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Riddhi. Thank you, Lokesh. My question to Professor is, along with critical pedagogy, there's a concept of critical feeling coming in, and teachers are encouraged more towards inculcating socio-emotional learning in their pedagogies. And I personally feel that along with critical thinking, children also should be encouraged towards learning about socio-emotional, building their socio-emotional thought. And I wanted professor's views, and what does he think about how critical feeling and SEL is complementing critical pedagogy?
I don't think that critical pedagogy, particularly as it emerged in the work of Paulo Freire, Stanley Aronowitz, Ellen Willis, a number of other people across the globe, has ever suggested that matters of emotions and feeling don't matter. I think that, you know, to simply create a protective space in which people can feel comfortable, but at the same time are willing to challenge each other, is an absolutely crucial issue. I think how we relate to people and how we provide a model, not teach, but provide a model for empathy and compassion is an absolutely essential element of critical pedagogy. At the same time, I'm very concerned about societies that address social problems almost exclusively through the language of therapy, through a therapeutic language, in which questions of, for instance, an exaggerated notion of mindfulness or feeling good seems to cancel out any kind of rational, sort of engaged dialogue in which we have to deal with issues that are sometimes uncomfortable. So I think the real question here is how did the question of emotions become crucial without collapsing the political into the personal?
Thank you, sir.
Okay. I'm sorry I have to go.
Thank
but I
you.
want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
For